So now that we've talked some about the history of diagnosis, particularly of dementia praecox, which is sort of the precursor to what we think of today as schizophrenia, it's also important to think a little bit about the history of treatment for people with schizophrenia. The history of treatment, in terms of thinking about it, we need to think about when schizophrenia might have emerged historically, and there are a couple different ideas about that. So one of the common ideas has been an idea called the industrialization hypothesis. And according to this model, schizophrenia emerged as a response to a new pathogen in the environment. Perhaps it was there before, but in very small numbers. And with the emergence of this pathogen, perhaps when people became closer in contact during the period of industrialization in the 1800s, that may have caused the growth or the emergence of the diagnosis of schizophrenia. Another argument has just been that it was typically less recognized in early history. According to this model, schizophrenia has been with us probably since the beginning of humankind, but it's only since the 1800s and 1900s that people have been able to identify it reliably. There are a couple reasons for this. We diagnose schizophrenia based on reports of symptoms. So depending on how those reports are described, the language used, it might not be easy to sort of determine whether someone had schizophrenia back in the 1700s or the 1600s. There's also the issue that schizophrenia was probably often thought as more of a spiritual problem than a medical problem, and therefore was dealt with by the church, by people who might have actually performed exorcisms to try and help the person, rather than medical science. There's also the idea that there's no physical record left of schizophrenia, so it becomes hard to know whether people in previous generations had suffered from it. We know, for example, from mummified bodies in Egypt, that you can actually see evidence in the lungs for pneumonia. So we know that pneumonia occurred back in ancient Egypt. We don't have that type of evidence for a disorder like schizophrenia. So that's the idea that it may be has been under-recognized historically. And that's why it's emerged so strongly in the 20th century. The last idea, which is more of a social construction approach, argues that schizophrenia is really a function of the definitions, the language, the culture of a specific time. This has been labeled the discontinuity hypothesis. And by this view, you really can't understand schizophrenia across different generations, that is, or different cultures, but rather it's a syndrome that's defined by the culture within which it occurs. Now, knowing these ideas about how schizophrenia might have emerged, we also want to think about the treatment of schizophrenia and how that might have developed historically. We know that the treatment of schizophrenia was very tightly linked to the emergence of the medical profession of psychiatry. So around the United States, this would be in the early 1800s, in the mid 1800s, there was this explosion or growth, huge growth of psychiatric hospitals. Connecticut Valley Hospital is a good example of that, being founded in 1867. The Institute of Living in Hartford is another good example of that, being founded in 1822. And McLean Hospital up in Boston, in the Boston area, being founded in 1811. These were major psychiatric facilities that emerged at this time and began to hospitalize large numbers of people with severe mental illness, and undoubtedly schizophrenia as well. We know that in the early 1800s, a lot of the treatment was what was called heroic cures, or approaches to treatment in which there would be processes such as bloodletting, purging. And this was true not just for psychiatric illness, but for all medical illnesses. The approach was typically to try and change the flow of the blood in a way to try and help people and improve their abilities. There's specific, as we talked about already, Benjamin Rush, who's really considered to be the father of American psychiatry, practiced at the Pennsylvania Hospital. He developed what was called a tranquilizer chair, which was one of the first real approaches to trying to treat people with severe mental illness with an actual theory. Rush designed this chair as a method of sort of restraining clients, but he also thought that by keeping them in this chair where he covered their eyes with linen and kept their arms steady with leather straps, that he could actually change the movement of blood in their body and that this change in movement in blood would lead to a decrease in psychiatric symptoms. In addition to these somatic interventions that we've talked about, bloodletting and purgatives that were very much a part of the practice of early psychiatry, there was also a movement that came over from Western Europe that was known as the moral treatment movement. This was a more humanistic approach to the treatment of people with severe mental illness, and it involved basically creating environments that were calming or relaxing. It has sometimes been referred to as the fresh air treatment, the idea that people with psychiatric illness, when placed in a stable, nurturing, structured environment, will benefit simply from the structure and the support of the institutions around them. Connecticut Valley Hospital, when it was built, was an example of this sort of asylum tradition. Again, the Institute of Living was another example of this. And in this approach to the treatment of psychiatric illness, people with psychiatric illness were exposed to a very structured sort of daily routine. They would get courses in education, they would have exercise each day, they would get vocational training. Many of the early psychiatric hospitals in the United States included farms as well, so that people would do some kind of vocational therapy where they work on a farm that was located right on the grounds of the psychiatric hospital. So there was this, again, this approach to treatment in the mid-1800s. It was driven by Enlightenment ideals, right, coming over from Western Europe. And these Enlightenment ideals suggested that, again, a supportive, constructive environment without even the necessity of medical intervention could alone improve the outcome of people with severe psychiatric illness. These ideas were driven by William Tuke, who is based in the United Kingdom, and by Philippe Pinel, who is based in Paris. And they made a big impact on sort of the emergence of asylums in the mid-1800s in the United States. So we've got these two sort of histories, this somatic, very early history, these heroic cures on the one hand. On the other hand, this asylum movement, this fresh air cure, where placing people in a relaxing, supportive setting will improve people's outcome. There then emerged in the 20s to the 30s a group of somatic interventions that really took sort of the psychiatric world by storm. There were four major interventions that I'll talk about. The first intervention that I'll talk about was what was called the fever cure. This was developed by a physician by the name of Wagner Jauregg. And what Wagner Jauregg did was basically approach symptoms of psychiatric illness or treat psychiatric symptoms of illness based on observations that he had made, that when people with a severe psychiatric illness had a fever, their symptoms would reduce. Their delusions, their hallucinations, perhaps their mood disorder would remit during the period of fever. Based on these findings, Wagner Jauregg established a treatment where he actually took the blood of someone who had been infected with malaria and then administered that to a patient with severe mental illness to bring about a fever. He then controlled the fever with quinine, used quinine, which was typically used to treat malarial fevers. He controlled it with quinine. And he found that this sort of invasive procedure, in fact, seemed to produce some reduction in symptoms. The fact that this was an accepted treatment at that time is indicated by the fact that Wagner Jauregg actually won the Nobel Prize in 1927 for this work. So we may look back at these treatments and think how invasive and intrusive they were to the patient, but it's important to understand also that at that time, the knowledge and tools around psychiatric illness was very, very limited. Another very common and somewhat less invasive treatment that was very popular in the 1920s and 30s was something called hydrotherapy. Hydrotherapy involved rooms where they would have many bathtubs, and they would administer a water of different temperatures. Sometimes it'd be administered as cold, sometimes the water would be administered as hot, sometimes it'd be somewhere in the middle. And doctors who were in charge of these wards would carefully instruct the staff to create just the right temperature for the client. The client would lie in this bath, sometimes for hours, entire day, and they'd be sort of kept in with a sort of a canvas top that would sort of hold them in the bath, and they would sit down in the bath, and this would be used to relax an agitated client. Hydrotherapy clinics were actually used in psychiatric hospitals throughout the United States in the 1920s and 30s. A third important somatic treatment was what has been referred to as insulin shock therapy. This was developed by Manfred Sekel, and this occurred in the 40s and 50s. And in this procedure, folks were administered insulin as a way of creating a hypoglycemic state. Patients would go into a temporary coma and then come out and be brought out of the coma by being administered sugar. Sekel reported that, in fact, these interventions seemed to improve a portion of the clients that were treated. And the last intervention that we'll talk about just briefly was the use of frontal lobotomies, which were very popular in the 50s into the 60s. In this procedure, typically parts of the frontal lobe would be cut as a way of reducing intense levels of agitation or delusion in people in the throes of psychiatric illness. Now, these somatic treatments, when we look back at them, of course, seem barbaric, terrible to the clients who suffered from them, and there's no doubt about it that these were very invasive procedures. But again, it's important to realize that the knowledge base at that time was very, very limited.